You feel the cold bronze blade scraping across your scalp. You're 9 years old, and every black braid you wore with pride yesterday is falling in lifeless coils at your feet. The morning sun burns through the open courtyard of Karnak's temple, and you want to cry, but when the first tear rolls down your cheek, a hand cracks across your face. Hard. "Servants of the god do not cry," the priestess hisses. "You have no tears anymore, no name. You belong to Amun now." In that moment, standing bareheaded and trembling in 1200 BC, a girl named Nefertari stopped being her father's daughter. She became property, and she would never leave these walls again. Before we go deeper, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me that a story buried for 3 millennia can reach so many people across every continent today. Let's be clear about what just happened to Nefertari. 3 days earlier, her father, a low-ranking official drowning in debt, brought her to the Temple of Amun at Karnak. He couldn't repay what he owed in grain or silver, so he paid with his child. The priests called it an offering. The records call it Hemet Netjer, servant of the god. History should call it what it was: state-sanctioned human trafficking wrapped in religious ceremony. And Nefertari wasn't alone. Across Egypt, from the Delta to Nubia, thousands of girls disappeared into temple service every year. They carried titles that sounded sacred: wife of the god, hand of the goddess, the pure ones. But behind those beautiful words was a system designed to break them, control them, and erase them. What follows isn't speculation. It's documented in temple papyri, administrative records, and inscriptions the priests never meant for outsiders to read. This is the truth the hieroglyphs tried to hide. When people imagine ancient Egyptian priestesses today, they picture grace: elegant women in white linen performing rituals, honored and revered. That image is a lie, a 3,000-year-old piece of propaganda. The term Hemet Netjer didn't mean honored priestess. It meant possession. These women were legally bound to the temple, stripped of autonomy, forbidden to marry, barred from owning property, and denied any say over what happened to their bodies. And that word, virgin, it didn't mean sexual innocence. In temple language, purity meant ritual purity, a state defined entirely by the priests who controlled it. It meant untouched by the profane world, kept pure for the gods, but in practice, it meant kept accessible to the men who claimed to speak for those gods. Most of these women never chose this life. Many were given away as children, long before they understood what it meant. Families dedicated daughters as religious offerings, sometimes seeking divine favor, other times just trying to survive. What looked like piety was permanent surrender. Others were handed over as debt payment. Egyptian temples weren't just houses of worship. They were economic empires that owned vast lands, lent grain and silver, and collected taxes. When families couldn't pay, they paid with their daughters. And then there were the girls who had no families to offer them. Girls like Mutmuya. She was 8 years old when Egyptian soldiers came to her Nubian village collecting tribute: gold, grain, ivory, children. Mutmuya was tied to 12 others with rope and forced to march north, a journey of hundreds of kilometers that took weeks. She didn't speak Egyptian. She had no idea where she was going. She cried until a guard struck her across the face and told her crying was forbidden. So she learned to cry in silence. When she finally arrived in Thebes, she was assigned to the temple of Mut, goddess of motherhood. The irony would haunt her for the rest of her life, serving a deity who symbolized mothers while being denied the right to ever become one herself. What happened next was designed to destroy identity. The process had a name: purification. First came the water ritual. The child was brought to a sacred pool, stripped naked, and washed repeatedly with water mixed with natron salt. It sounded cleansing. It was violation. These weren't baths. They were invasive examinations disguised as holy acts. When Nefertari was led to the stone pool, 3 priests and 2 older women were waiting. She hesitated to remove her clothes. One woman tore them away. The water was freezing. A priest stepped into the pool beside her and ordered her to stand still. Then, slowly, methodically, he began touching her, running his hands over her body under the pretense of ensuring ritual purity. When she pulled back, he grabbed her arm. "The gods are watching," he said coldly. "They are testing your obedience." Nefertari froze. That moment, disguised as sacred duty, was her first violation. It taught her that her body no longer belonged to her. After purification came the shaving, every strand of hair removed. Officially, it preserved ritual purity. In reality, it destroyed identity. Hair represented beauty, individuality, pride. Removing it erased the self. When Nefertari looked at her reflection in a bronze mirror afterward, she didn't recognize the face staring back. That person wasn't Nefertari anymore. It was what the temple had molded her into. Next came renaming. Her birth name, the one her mother gave her, was taken forever. The priests assigned her a new identity, Neferet Nebet. Beautiful is the lady. She was ordered never to speak her true name again. The name connecting her to family was declared dead. She was no longer her father's daughter. She was a creation of the temple, a living offering. But the darkest ritual was still to come, the divine marriage ceremony. Each girl was symbolically married to the god she would serve. The temple called it a great honor. The child was dressed in white linen, her bald head covered with an ornate wig, her small body adorned with jewelry. She was brought before the deity's statue to swear vows of eternal service. When Mutmuya underwent this ritual at 10 years old, she was led into the inner sanctuary, a dark chamber dominated by the towering figure of the goddess Mut. The high priest began chanting in the sacred tongue, claiming it was Mut's voice speaking through him. He proclaimed that Mutmuya was chosen, blessed to become the goddess's bride. Then he ordered her to repeat the words, "I take the vows. I give myself to Mut. My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever." She repeated every phrase without hesitation, without understanding. That moment bound her to the temple for life. The priests recorded it as a holy union, but it was a legal contract of ownership. A girl married to a god could never marry a man, could never have recognized children, was bound to that institution until death. And here's what made it truly sinister. The priests saw themselves as living representatives of the gods. You'll understand what that meant soon enough. Life inside the temple was designed with absolute precision, structured, isolated, controlled to eliminate any chance of rebellion. Nefertari would wake before sunrise in a communal dormitory surrounded by dozens of other young women. Privacy didn't exist. The morning began with purification rituals, then hours of assigned labor, weaving cloth, grinding grain, preparing offerings, cleaning sanctuaries. Monotonous work disguised as holy service, but what made it unbearable wasn't the labor. It was the silence. The women were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Any unnecessary conversation was punished harshly. The silence severed human connection, preventing friendship or trust. They were surrounded by others, yet completely alone. Nefertari's only friend was a girl named Takat. They worked side by side at the looms, whispering quietly when they thought no one was watching. One afternoon, the supervisor noticed. Without warning, she struck Takat across the back of the neck with a wooden stick. Takat was dragged outside while the overseer shouted, "This is what happens to those who break the silence." For 3 days, Takat was gone. When she returned, she never spoke again, not even in whispers. Her eyes were empty. 2 months later, she vanished completely. The supervisor simply announced that Takat had been found impure and returned to the gods. No one was told what that meant. Everyone knew. Surveillance went beyond silence. The women were watched constantly, their movements restricted, contact with families forbidden. They were subjected to regular purity inspections, deeply invasive examinations performed by priests. Nefertari learned to disconnect her mind from her body during them, to let her thoughts drift away while the violations occurred. If a woman showed unhappiness or resisted, punishment followed: extra labor, starvation, beatings. Escape was impossible. They'd been taken so young they no longer remembered life beyond the walls. They had no skills, no home to return to, no memory of freedom. They were trapped not just by stone, but by conditioning. When Mutmuya turned 16, 8 years into temple service, she still carried faint memories of home, of her mother's songs. One night, she began humming a Nubian tune under her breath. An older woman heard and reported her immediately. The next morning, Mutmuya was dragged before the high priest. He struck her across the face. "You have no mother," he said coldly. "You have no tongue but that of the gods. You have no memories except those we give you." She was locked in a storage room for 7 days. When she emerged, something inside her had died. She never sang again. Now, listen carefully, because this is where the story becomes far darker. Among the temple women, some held a special designation: Hemet, Nejer, and Amun, wives of the god. They participated in rituals known as sacred unions, ceremonies supposedly meant to reenact divine myths and ensure Egypt's fertility. The texts describing them sound poetic, filled with metaphor and religious symbolism. But those beautiful words hid something horrific. High-ranking priests, especially the high priest of Amun, claimed to physically embody the god during these ceremonies. They dressed in divine garments, performed elaborate rituals, and declared that their actions represented the god working through them. The women chosen were told they were about to receive the god's blessing. They were brought into inner sanctuaries and warned that resistance would bring divine wrath, that defiance could doom all of Egypt. And then the priests, claiming divine right, enacted what they called the god's sacred marriage. Let's be clear, these were not holy unions. They were acts of coercion, encounters between powerful men and powerless women indoctrinated from childhood to believe their bodies belonged to the gods. When Nefertari was selected for her first sacred union ritual, she was 14 years old. She was told that Amun himself would bless her. On the night of the ritual, she was led into the temple's inner sanctuary. The air hung thick with incense. The high priest, his face hidden behind an ornate mask, approached and instructed her to submit completely. Nefertari didn't understand. She froze as his hands reached to remove her garments. Then she understood. Instinctively, she stepped back. The other priests whispered reassurances. This was the god's will. The high priest warned that refusing would be blasphemy, an insult to Amun himself. What followed was recorded as a successful sacred union. But Nefertari knew the truth. It wasn't sacred, it was violation, rape wrapped in ritual, disguised as religion. Some women endured these unions many times. Some conceived children. Those children were officially declared blessed, yet they stood as undeniable proof of what had been done to their mothers. Daughters were raised to serve the temples just as their mothers had. Sons were trained as priests. The cycle sustained itself. At 16, Nefertari realized she was pregnant. She was moved to separate lodgings where other expectant women lived, every one of them victims of the same system. An older woman told her softly, "Don't hope too much. Once your child is weaned, it will be taken. If it's a girl, she'll serve here like us. If it's a boy, the priests will raise him. You'll still belong to the temple, just as your child will." Nefertari gave birth to a daughter. For 3 brief years, she cared for her. Then the girl was taken to begin her own training. Nefertari returned to her duties, seeing her daughter only from afar in temple corridors, never allowed to speak, never allowed to acknowledge her. Watching her little girl endure the same breaking process she had suffered was the cruelest punishment of all. What happened to those who dared resist was meant to terrify everyone else. Some women suffered what the records call dedication to the desert. dragged beyond the temple walls and left alone under the burning sun without food or water. Death by exposure, slow and excruciating. One such woman was Henry VIII. During a midday meal, she suddenly stood and shouted, "This is not holy. These men are not gods. We are prisoners." The hall went silent. Henry VIII was seized instantly and dragged outside. Every woman in the temple was forced to watch as she was led into the desert and abandoned. The next morning, they were brought to see what remained of her body, half devoured by wild animals. The high priest declared, "This is the fate of the impure." But Henry VIII's defiance left another kind of legacy. It taught the others that rebellion had to be silent, invisible. Resistance survived in secret, meanings hidden within songs, brief glances exchanged during prayers, small acts of defiance like deliberate weaving errors that spelled faint words. I resist. Most of the temple women died within those walls, spending entire lifetimes in enforced service. When they died, they were buried in unmarked mass graves, their names erased. When Nefertari died at 52, her body was placed in a pit beside 3 other women. No coffin, no funeral rites. Her daughter, now grown and serving the same institution, was forbidden to mourn. The order was simple: forget she ever existed. Yet some refused to disappear entirely. In hidden corners on fragments of stone, they carved short messages. I was born free. They took that from me. Remember that we were people. And there was Mutmuya. 2 days before her death, she etched her final words into the wall of a dark chamber. I came from beyond the first waterfall. My mother's name was Manitori. I remember her voice. I never forgot who I was before they took me. This life was not my choice. If you find this, know that I lived. Know that I remembered. Her message still whispers from the stone. I existed. I mattered. Remember me. This is the truth the Egyptian temples tried to bury. Thousands of women taken as children, exploited for decades, erased in death. Today, visitors marvel at these temples' beauty, admiring pillars and carvings, rarely realizing the suffering that unfolded within them. But when you look at those ancient walls now, you'll see them differently. Behind the painted scenes of gods and kings were women like Nefertari, Mutmuya, Takat, Henry VIII, and countless others whose names are lost. They were real people who endured unimaginable cruelty and still found ways to fight back, even if only through a scratch in the stone. The temples still stand. The stones still remember. And now you do too.